If I was to begin today by asking you the question, are you happy? You might respond by saying, well, really that depends on what you mean by happiness. And if you did so, it could be the beginning of a rather lengthy and very interesting discussion on the philosophical and theological meaning of being happy. But what does it mean to be happy? This question is central, I think, to everyone's yearning for fulfillment in life. For centuries, it has been the key question in philosophical debates about the meaning of human life. The ancient Greek philosophers debated how humans could align their own lives with the created order in order to be happy or to have a blessed life. And the Greek word makarios, which is the central words that we find in the Beatitudes of Matthew chapter 5 and verses 1 through 12, is a fairly common word in the New Testament and in ancient Greek. And it's not really hard to understand. But it is difficult to translate into English, strangely enough. By far the most common translation of the Beatitudes use the word blessed. But the problem with blessed is that it sounds a little unreal. It's like a quality that applies only to a special group of people, whose example may appear to be a bit unobtainable for us. One very well-known Bible writer has translated makarios as greatly honored. This is another good option for translating this word because it emphasizes the theme of reversal that is implied in the Beatitudes. The meek and the merciful are not revered by the world's standards, but they are honored by God and by those who would align their lives with God's ways. But there is another option for translating makarios that we may consider, and that is to use the word happy. So Jesus says, happy are the poor in spirit, happy are the merciful, happy are the pure in heart. Now let me admit that happy is not a perfect translation, because in our Western cultures, it can convey a very thin, happy-go-lucky kind of happiness. And this is not what the ancient philosophers meant, for they were well aware of the suffering and the conflict in human lives and in all of human experience. And it cannot be, surely, what Jesus means either, or he would not call those who mourn happy. He's describing a deeper happiness, a kind of happiness that not only comes from aligning God's will with one's own will with God's will, but understanding that this was the central point that Jesus was trying to get over in his Sermon on the Mount. When this same word, makarios, is used in the Old Testament, that's exactly how we translate it, happy. Consider the very first psalm. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on God's law they meditate day and night. So the psalmists declare happy those who delight in the law, those who take refuge in God, those who observe justice and practice righteousness. Now, the writer of the Psalms was quite aware that the wicked pick on, persecute, and scorn the righteous. So this happiness cannot be a simple feeling that things are going well, or that one is well liked. These people are happy because they live their lives in a way that is orientated towards God's loving kindness. They see the world the way God sees it. And Matthew, in recording the Sermon on the Mount, is saying the same thing. Those who long to follow God's word, who seek the righteousness, holiness, and justice of God, they are happy. Now, other people may appear happy, at least outwardly. They may be successful in the world's terms. They may have expensive and fashionable homes and clothes. They may be able to go on exotic holidays. But that is not real happiness, for it does not reflect the things that are important to God. The word happy focuses on our emphasis on the present state of the people that are discussed here. While blessedness can sound like a future promise of good things to those who suffer now, happiness makes sense as something people strive for in this lifetime. It's not something that we hold out for in some future life. And although they experience difficulty of many kinds, Jesus attributes a present tense state of happiness to those whom he describes. Of course, there is a future element to these biblical statements about happiness. The psalmist knew that sometimes God's deliverance is not something that happens immediately. Sometimes the wicked do prosper. The wealthy exploit the poor. The innocent are convicted. They were imprisoned and in some cases killed. The writer of the Psalms also knew this, but still they affirm that the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. That's from the same Psalm, Psalm number 1. So God sees the actions of the wicked, and God listens to the cries of the poor. In the fullness of time, God will establish justice. When we come to compare the Psalms and Matthew, we find that Matthew has, as it were, turned up the volume regarding the future promised to those who live according to God's ways. In Matthew chapter 5, each of the verses 4 through 9 makes a statement about the future. For example, happy are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The present tense in the first clause suggests that the meek are happy now, but they are happy in part because they see the big picture. They live in the knowledge that the appearances of the world do not correspond to the ultimate realities of God's kingdom. Their inheritance is secure. This does not mean, of course, that the happy cease to care about the world. The Beatitudes are the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus goes on to say a lot about life in this world. And he starts with the commandments naming explicitly, you shall not murder, and you shall not commit adultery. He goes on to other rather difficult teachings, like turning the other cheek and loving enemies. These teachings give depth to what it means to be meek, to be a peacemaker, to be pure in heart. Happiness is not simply a way of seeing the world as God sees it. It is a way of life. It motivates our moral behavior. It motivates deep humility. It moves people to seek justice and to love mercy. It's difficult to contemplate the brokenness of our world today. And it's even more difficult to know ourselves to be complicit to some extent in its injustices. But happiness is never something that can be found without that knowledge. We can never be happy in the sense Matthew means by ignoring or by downplaying the suffering of others. And this is the paradox of happiness. It sits face to face with the pain of injustice, the pain of sickness, and the pain of death. Yet, it's still somehow strangely appropriate to use the word happy.